I think it's a kind of priority for Remarque to put the reader inside the head of Paul to the greatest extent possible. So we can sympathize with him, we see the war through his eyes, and we see the brutality, the kind of inhumanity that Paul experiences, and also some of the changes that he and his comrades undergo.
Hello, Liam. Thank you very much for joining us for our podcast on Westen, nichts, Neues. And today we're going to talk about the novel in light of pacifism in the Weimar Republic. But before we get into this, to start us off, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you got to Oxford, what you're working on right now maybe, and most interestingly for our audience probably, why you chose to study German literature?
So I'm Liam Johnston, McCondach, and I teach German literature at St John's College here in Oxford. And so I suppose my route into studying German literature was quite direct in a way. I mean, German was always a subject that I'd enjoyed at school. I was lucky enough to be able to learn French and German at school. And I really enjoyed reading. And so having another language in which I could read books had its own kind of massive appeal for me. So I picked it up from there and have kept going right through to the present moment. So my research interests are sort of broadly in comparative literature. So I look a lot at modern and contemporary German and French literatures, with a particular emphasis on Bertolt Brecht. So my thesis was written on Bertolt Brecht and his kind of afterlife and reception in France.
Great. All right, then let's turn to Im Westen, nichts, Neues. This novel has been called both a war novel and an anti-war novel at the same time. What do you think it is? And you're allowed to give me a really brief answer as well.
So it certainly sits on the border between the two in a way. I mean, it's a novel that's very much about the war, but I think we need to differentiate it from other war novels that were published in the 1920s, especially in the kind of earlier 20s. So it's certainly not a novel that romanticizes the war, that presents the war as an adventure. And I think it's quite clear that the novel takes a critical stand towards war. It's very unsparing in its portrayal of the brutal reality of war. And so in that sense is an anti-war novel. So I think I would probably place it in the latter camp.
Okay. Could you give us some more examples why you would say it's one anti-war novel and a war novel?
So I mean, I think I'd start with thinking about the perspective that we get. So we're not given this kind of very detailed historical overview of different battles, of different tactical decisions, even the politics and the kind of historical background of the war. The events that Paul lives through are recounted in a very direct, a very kind of, straightforward manner. So the prose isn't very kind of stylized, it's very unadorned. This has a clear impact on how we read the novel and how we experience the novel. I think it's a kind of priority for Remarque to put the reader inside the head of Paul to the greatest extent possible. So we can sympathize with him, we see the war through his eyes, and we see the brutality, the kind of inhumanity that Paul experiences, and also some of the changes that he and his comrades undergo. So the kind of limiting of experience that I think is very important for Remarque.
Could you give us a few examples from the text itself for this?
So I mean, I think there are various scenes we could point to. I think as readers, there might be kind of specific instances that stand out, or specific instances that strike us as particularly shocking. So the scenes in the hospital, for example, and the narrator mentions, or Paul mentions, how he'd like to be able to show wider society and to show the world what's going on in these hospitals and the fate that has befallen this generation. But for me, I think the passages that express most clearly this kind of pacifist anti-war sentiment are the sections where we see the other side, as it were, when we encounter the enemy soldiers. So there's a passage where Paul is made responsible for guarding the Russian prisoners of war. And yeah, he manages to not quite empathize with them, but he takes a great deal of pity on them. He sees that they've been dehumanized. They're only given the very, basic requirements that they need to live. And there's a sense of the kind of arbitrariness of war that Paul expresses very poignantly at that point. I think that it could have easily been him in their position and it could have been them in his position. And were these prisoners of war released, then they would have shot at him and he would have had to shoot at them. So there's this kind of immediate interhuman or intersubjective sympathy that's very contingent, let's say. And this is, again, a sort of poignant sense that we get in the famous scene where Paul kills the French soldier who's fallen into the crater with him. And the way the narrative develops at this point, we go from Paul describing the soldier as just kind of a body, as he can't really grasp the humanity or the severity of what he's doing. It's this kind of immediate, very instinctual impulse just to kill the soldier, to protect his own life. And it's only as he's kind of very much put face to face with the dying soldier, when he can start to imagine that this soldier had a life, that he had a family, it's then that it really strikes home that war is just senseless brutality. There's no real point to what Paul has been forced to do in this moment. And so I think those passages where we can see Paul kind of reckoning with his own loss of humanity, reckoning with the loss of humanity that's been imposed on others as well, I think, they're particularly poignant.
Yeah, because I think those are the moments where this sort of other, the enemy that is always like looming there, they're always shooting, but they're distant. They're in their trenches, Paul and his comrades are in their trenches. They get a face and we as a reader join in. I also particularly like that you mentioned the Russian prisoner of war scene because, yes, as you said, Paul then realizes this could be me to an extent. They also have a life. And I think he tries getting a part of his humanity back in a way when he does share his favorite food that his cancer-sick mother sends to him with them, and then later also with his other comrades at the front again. So there's this sort of trying to be human and also human with them. But you're right, the underlying thing is if they were to escape, they would shoot at him and he would have to shoot at them. So that's
right, yeah. And I think there are these glimmers of humanity that kind of shine through quite forcefully in the novel. And there's also, I suppose, a strong sense of Kameradschaft that comes through, right?
Yeah.
So there are these kind of bonds that, in spite of everything, remain very stable and kind of bind Paul quite closely to the soldiers on his fellow side, but also, I think, very importantly for the novel as a kind of anti-war pacifist novel with the enemy soldiers. There is this kind of very clear universalism and an internationalism almost to the novel, which perhaps kind of led to its success, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why we're still talking about this novel as a particularly powerful statement against the war and war in general today.
Absolutely. And if we talk about this anti-war sentiment now, can we talk a bit about the political climate at the time of publication, specifically in the Weimar Republic?
Yeah. So when the novel is published, we're sort of in not exactly the kind of final stages of the Weimar Republic, but we're certainly getting there. And I think a lot of the political crises that people might associate with this period of German history are becoming particularly clear. So, there is a kind of tension in German society between a kind of effort to remilitarize, to kind of build back up the army, the navy after the Treaty of Versailles, that's opposed by, I suppose, a kind of liberal centre and also the left-wing parties, the Social Democrats and the Communist Party. So there's an election in 1928, so around the time when the novel is being kind of edited for publication. So I think these kind of social debates must have been very prominent in Remarque's mind. Maybe if I can talk a bit about the publication history as well.
Absolutely, yes, and maybe the changes that were happening as well.
Yeah, exactly. So Remarque kind of makes a first draft of the novel in 1917, and it's a very short draft. So that's where he's trying to really capture the immediate experience of the war. So the war is still going on. He's still a soldier. He starts making some notes when he's injured and is recuperating in hospital. He then returns to that in 1927. And the text that he writes in 1927 is slightly different from the novel that we have in front of us today, and is more pronounced in its political critique. It's more pronounced in its pacifism. And his publishers basically told him to turn that down. They didn't think that would find quite the right audience, or they thought that might limit the success of the novel. So Remarque went away and duly did this. And so the version that we have, it was serialized and then published in novel form, is slightly softened, I suppose. So there are certain passages, for instance, we might think of the very brief moment towards the end of the novel where the Kaiser comes to meet the troops. So if you look at the original version of that, then it's slightly more satirical, let's say. It's trying more, in a more kind of direct way to make fun of the Kaiser and the German military political establishment. So things like that vanish. And I think we can see the novel as both kind of responding to the war itself and also the kind of aftermath of the war, and the collective memory of war. So, I mean, the novel is published exactly halfway between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, so kind of 10 years on either side. And we might see that as kind of a key turning point in German history, basically. We can see the right and the kind of nationalist, fascist right gaining more and more ground, and we all know the disastrous consequences of that. And so I think it's an effort on Remarque's part to really grip his reader and to say, this is what war looks like. This is what the reality is that lies behind these efforts to kind of remilitarize and to rearm.
Yeah, we're going to talk in our next episode a lot about the reception from the right of the novel, because it's a very interesting story as well, also of the film, the 1930 film. But yeah, you have mentioned Remarque now as an author, and I found this very interesting quote where he himself claims that neither he nor the novel, Im Westen nichts Neues, are political. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so I would start by giving that very annoying answer, which is to say that it depends how we might define political. I think the novel certainly has this very clear humanist appeal. It's anti-war and political in that sense. And I don't think it's controversial to say that. I think Remarque would like a world in which there is no war, right? I think the ways in which perhaps Remarque and the novel itself aren't political is that we don't get a kind of party political program. The presentation of the war isn't one that we could map onto a specific ideology of the time. And I suppose we could break that down into thinking of sort of left-wing perspectives and more right-wing perspectives of the war too. So when the novel was published, as we might expect, it was kind of very harshly critiqued and rejected by the right, who called it a kind of defamation of brave German soldiers. But I think there are passages in the novel that the right-wing critics might have kind of overlooked. So towards the end of the novel, Paul is reflecting on what has happened, and he says the German army are in a position where they don't feel like they've been defeated in a military sense. They don't feel like the other side were better soldiers, but there are these contextual factors, not least the kind of the arrival of American troops into the war that are going to make the decisive difference. So he's not quite buying into the myth that the right would propagate, but he's not totally denying it either, right? Or the novel doesn't totally deny that either. if we think of a kind of left-wing perspective of the war, then there are moments where Paul and his comrades will voice a kind of frustration with pre-war German society, especially in its hierarchy. So a kind of, really quite a strong dislike for teachers, parents, the people who Paul and his comrades feel have kind of blindly led a younger generation into the war, who have whipped up this kind of hysteria. Let them down, yeah. So we might say there's something slightly left-wing in that, but it's certainly not what would map onto, I don't know, a socialist or communist historiography. So there's no sense of the war being this kind of, the result of competing empires, basically competing industrialized empires. So we're spared that, and I think it's kind of a healthy position for the novel to be in a way, or allowed it to become successful in the way that it has. That the politics are slightly vague, slightly naive, we might say, if we were being harsh, and there's a kind of utopian force to that I think has allowed the novel to be disseminated and read so widely, and to be interesting to us today.
Yes, and also on an international scale, not just for us in Germany, although it is the story of a German soldier and his troops, it's an international experience in a way. And I think that's why it had an attraction. It was also made into a film so quickly after it was released. Yeah. All right, thank you. To round all of this up, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm asking all of my guests right now, and it might be the hardest one. In your opinion, what makes Im Westen nichts Neues a German classic?
That's a good question, and I think I'd work backwards, perhaps. So I think I would start with the reception of the novel, and think about the impact that it's had on probably millions of readers by this point, right? I think it's very hard to read the novel and not have it leave some kind of emotional effect on you, right? So I would say that by the virtue of its of the force of the critique that the novel offers of war, by virtue of how powerful that critique continues to be, then the novel is quite clearly a classic.
That's a good and very thoughtful answer.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very thought-provoking conversation. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.